This is what food security looks like, having dependable access to nutritious and affordable food. Canada is a land of plenty. Rich soil, skilled farmers, and an agile food distribution network help keep our food system self-sufficient. Our food system is linked to our prosperity. It provides 1 in 9 Canadian jobs. It also generates $140 billion of the country's gross domestic product, and it feeds 40 million Canadians. In fact, Canada produces so much food, we have surplus. We export over $90 billion in agri-food products every year. We grow enough food to feed ourselves and help feed the world. But all this shouldn't be taken for granted. Extreme weather, geopolitical disruptions, and the economy can throw our food supply off course. From farmers to consumers, everyone has a role to play in ensuring Canadians continue to have access to nutritious and affordable food. For individuals, food security means having food easily available, like in grocery stores. It means the food available meets our dietary needs. It means food is relatively affordable for most people. It also means there are social programs in place, like food banks, that help people get nutritious food if they can't acquire it themselves. For the food system, food security means developing innovation and technology to grow and diversify our food supply. It means making our food supply even more resilient to extreme weather and economic and geopolitical disruptions. It also means using sustainable farming practices that allow farmers to grow more food on less farmland to feed our growing population, and practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions produced by agriculture. Where would Canadians be without that food security that exists in Canada? Can you illustrate or paint a picture of what life could look like in Canada without food security?
We see pictures from around the world where we have food lines and when countries that, primarily countries that import a lot of their food. What Canada has is this buffer because we export a lot. So if we have a bad year, it doesn't mean there's not enough to go around. It just means that we perhaps have a little less to export and it becomes a little more expensive. If you are sort of a subsistence, produce enough to get by and you can't produce enough, or in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine where exports from Ukraine disappeared, we saw countries that all of a sudden couldn't get food. And we see bread lines, and we see food riots, and we see images of starvation. And so we're lucky we've never seen that to a significant degree in Canada. But the fact that we get it, we have access to it, we might sometimes have a little less choice, really speaks to how strong and robust the Canadian system is.
Why should consumers care? Why is it so important for consumers to know more about the food system and how it works?
Food security is happening across the country, and it's happening to people that typically you wouldn't consider, people with jobs, people with university educations. So as much as people want to believe it couldn't happen to them, it can. So the more you know about your food system, the better chance you have of it not happening to you in some respect. Like you can garden, you can look at different ways and different systems of managing your food better so that you're not one day in a place of trying to get food onto your table and it's impossible.
So we know it's important. Can you tell us what are some of the most important aspects that consumers should know about food security?
Again, food security can impact anybody. And really, I think what we saw at the beginning of COVID, it didn't matter how much money you had. Everybody felt it for a minute because the shelves were barren because we had supply chain issues and people were hoarding food. So even if you had a lot of money in the bank, you could actually feel what it felt like to not be able to get the food that you typically buy and sometimes couldn't buy anything. So it's really important because we live in a community, right? We're all in this together. We should be working together and playing together and learning together and supporting each other. So if you don't know what's happening all of the communities in Canada, it will impact your own life. Food insecurity will impact your own life, even if you're food secure, because you're seeing it, right? We're seeing a lot more homeless people. You're seeing a lot more addiction and mental health issues. There's a lot of systems issues that are impacting this. So it is touching you whether you want to believe it or not.
There are aspects, though, that may come as a surprise to consumers. For example, best before dates. There's some knowledge that is not common to consumers. What can you share about some information that consumers should know?
Yeah, that's a great point. So that's really about food waste and the amount of food that Canada is wasting. And it's 58% of all the food produced for us is lost or wasted across the supply chain and at home. And best before dates are one of the most ridiculous things ever, right? So in Canada, there are only 5 foods that expire. And if a food expires, don't eat it. That is baby formula, because babies need the nutrients. It is products like Ensure for seniors, because again, you need those nutrients. A protein bar, because if I'm running a race and I need those calories, I need those calories. The 2 others are by prescription only, so don't worry about it unless your doctor says so. Everything else is a best before date, and it's about peak freshness. It's not about food safety. And so what you're finding is people that are actually food insecure are so convinced that it's about food safety that they're throwing away perfectly good food when they could be eating it.
As strong as the Canadian food system is, there are elements that can't be controlled, elements that threaten its success and sovereignty.
Food sovereignty is the ability, the freedom, the resources to produce culturally appropriate food for a population. So I would argue that Canada is a food sovereign nation because we can produce all the food we need to eat. In fact, we are a significant exporter of food. And the fact that we have this sort of food sovereignty contributes significantly to the fact that, for the most part, we have food security in this country. Now, there are people who are food insecure in this country. And so in some countries where there are disruptions or they have droughts or they are not able to afford to import food, access to food is an issue, and that becomes a significant part of food security. In Canada, the significant issue we have is not the ability to access food. We produce and get into position to buy lots of great food. The problem some Canadians have is the lack of ability to be able to pay for it. You know, we could be making efforts to improve the gap between the wealthy and the poor. The best ways we can improve food security for Canadians is to raise the incomes of the lowest income people in Canada, not that we have to improve access to food. There's lots of food there. It's just having people with the ability to buy it.
There are, would you agree, however, some threats to our Canadian food system, to Canadian food security, and a lot of it is out of our control. What would you say are the biggest threats to food security in Canada now?
So let's talk about the access side of food security. To me, the big ones are climate change, labor, which is becoming an acute issue throughout our food system, not only from production, processing, even in food service, and to a degree in grocery, so throughout the system. And the third one is supply chain disruptions. Because Canada has been very lucky, and we produce wheat that Ukraine produces, we produce canola and sunflowers that Ukraine produces. So when that Ukrainian exports disappeared, some countries actually didn't have product, at least in the short term. We continued to have product, but the global price of those products went up and contributed to the significant inflation that we've seen in the last couple of years. And so it made food more expensive in Canada. Again, it did not affect, in this circumstance, it did not affect access to that food. It simply made it more expensive. The Canadian food system provided a buffer. While it didn't protect us from price increases, it did protect us from shortages. And I think that that's an important distinction to make. Let's talk about climate change, and I'll give you a very specific example. We're seeing a rise in extreme weather. We're seeing more frequent and more extreme weather patterns. All of a sudden, that extreme weather put our supply at risk. And that's not unique. Europe in the winter of 2023 had a shortage of a lot of produce because of droughts in North Africa and Southern Europe, Spain, Southern Italy, and we can see it here as well. And that's not just internationally. We saw significant floods in the Fraser Valley, which disrupted supply chains and also production. A few years ago, we had a significant drought in Western Canada, which affected beef producers' ability to produce enough feed, and so these increased frequency of this extreme weather means that we are going to see more frequent disruptions to production of specific things in specific areas. So we're having trouble finding people who both are able to and willing to work in agricultural production, agricultural processing, all the way through the supply chain. And that's causing disruptions in supply. If we don't have the people to produce, we'll have shortages. I've heard stories of, and not this spring, but last spring, of asparagus producers who have asparagus ready to go in the field, but no one to harvest it. And so if we can produce it, but we can't harvest it, process it, bring it to the market, we lose that product.
Even though the Canadian food system is one of the best in the world, it's getting even better. It has to secure our future. What is the food industry doing to encourage and promote food sustainability?
I think the food industry has really changed a lot lately. I mean, there's way more that can be done, but we're looking at ESG in a whole different way, right? And the greenwashing of yesterday is not acceptable today. So industry can look at their whole supply chain and look at where the waste is happening. And some of these interventions to manage it are so simple. There are case studies that will show you, like, just by putting a lid on one thing on the ground, you're losing less food. There's an organization called EnviroStewards that has a ton of case studies, but I'll give you one, and it was Campbell's Soup. So Campbell's Soup, for example, had a line and they had carrot soup, say. And then the next line of food was potato soup. So every time they saw a carrot, they would just throw it. Well, all they had to do was take the carrot and throw it in a different bin and then use it later. And they did that. And so they saved, I think, $250,000 per facility. So they're really, they're not difficult interventions, some of them. But the most basic one that really has to happen, and it's a global issue, food is global, it's measurement. We need to have a global measurement standard that everybody is measuring the same way, setting targets and hitting those targets. And if they're forced to do that, then they will suddenly flourish with innovation. Things will change when you are forced to measure, manage, and either get some support so you can do it. There were a lot of small and mid-sized businesses. Absolutely, we should support them with funding because there's going to be an upfront cost. But if you're a big business and you're not doing it and you can afford to do it, then there has to be some kind of taxation or something that will force these businesses to do it.
The reality of today's agriculture is that we have people who manage. They might still get a bit of manure on their boots and a bit of dirt under their fingernails, but the role is considerably different. Technology is making our system more targeted to what we want and what we need, and also more sustainable and to protect us from some of these impacts of climate change. So technology has allowed us to produce more in different ways and with lower impact on the environment. So right here at the University of Guelph, we have people working on the genetics of dairy cows to reduce the methane emissions so that we can actually choose genetically cows that produce less methane. And so technology is providing a real opportunity for us to produce more and produce it more sustainably and produce products that are better suited to us as human beings. So the science behind food production is just amazing, and the potential is huge. How we're producing milk and beef, we're selecting for lower emissions. Precision agriculture allows us to do only what we need to do in a way that optimizes production, but also minimizes the passes over the field. precision agriculture also allows us to target specifically parts of the field with fertilizer and other things, which says, here's where we need it, here's where we don't, so we're not over applying. It not only saves money, making food more affordable, but it reduces the emission from that excess fertilizer as well, or the leaching into waterways that can cause algal blooms and things like that. So we're doing a bunch of things not only to improve food, but to reduce the environmental impact of food production.
Another aspect that's really important to food sustainability is diversity. Diversity in crops, but also in production.
Diversification becomes critical as a measure to make our system more robust to impacts of climate change and labor. So diversification can take place in a couple of different ways. We can produce in different ways. So to protect ourselves from Southern California's bad weather, we're increasing greenhouse production in Canada. Now, economically, that's getting better and better so that the price gaps between the two are getting smaller. But we're producing lettuce, peppers, berries, all sorts of things tomatoes in greenhouses in Canada that provide an alternate source of production for when specific areas might have production issues. It is amazing what we're able to do. Science is allowing us to understand food systems better. Science is allowing us to produce food more safely. Science is allowing us to produce food that is more healthy for us. Science is allowing us to reduce the environmental impact of food production. It is amazing how significantly food production and food processing has changed. That's to a significant degree invisible to us as consumers. But Canada is not just blessed with an amazing land base and an amazing climate and amazing food producers, but with this knowledge economy, both in an academic at universities, but at companies that are bringing the possibilities to market that will ensure food security for a long time, that to a large degree is invisible to consumers.
The Canadian food system is constantly evolving and adapting to meet the changing needs of society. Consumers also play a big part in Canada's food security and can adopt practices that strengthen its sustainability. Coming back to consumers, and you mentioned it just a little earlier on as well, what can consumers do? Do you have a top 5 list of things consumers can do?
Sure.
What is important that everyone can start doing as of tomorrow?
Best before dates is always my number one. Best before dates do not mean bad after, like use your senses to manage your food. If you are worried about your food, throw it in the freezer. All food can be frozen, even milk, right? It might not be, the texture will change, so you use it for cooking after that. Everything can freeze. If you looked in my freezer, the only meat you're ever going to find is 50% off. It's all the 50% off meat that goes right in my freezer. And then you pull it out and you eat it. That's great. Buy less food. Save some money. Like we all buy too much. We buy at big box stores. Maybe we think we're going to have a party, or maybe we do have a party and we always overbuy because we have this cultural thing of like, we never want to run out of food. And then in the end, we're throwing a lot of it away. And also storing your food. Most of us don't actually know how to store our food properly. So it does go bad faster. So if you've got milk, don't put it on the door of the fridge, put it inside the fridge, right? Like just leave your condiments on the door of the fridge. But also know what produce you can put together, because if it's a lot of ethylene gas on it, you don't want to put it beside something that will ripen really quickly. So
Such
storage. So don't put onions and potatoes together. And I know most people put onions and potatoes together. Separate them. They don't want to be together. And I mean, if you have any nylons, I don't know if that's a thing anymore, to be honest, but you put onions in a nylon and then you like put knots in between, they'll last forever. Like, so there's those pieces. And same with bananas. Bananas have a lot of ethylene. Don't put them right beside your avocados unless you want them to
ripen overnight.
Which is fine. If you do, that's great. So really, there's lots of storage tips. Like at Second Harvest, we have tons of resources so that will show you how long your food will last, how to store things properly, how to waste less food at the home.
In Canada, an alarming amount of food produced for Canadians is lost or wasted along the supply chain.
We waste more food than any other region in the world. And it's 58% of all the food produced for Canadians. Now, some of that is completely unavoidable and things that you're not going to eat, like bones. So that falls inside of that. But 32% of that is completely avoidable, completely edible. It's 11.2 million metric tons of food that, unfortunately, not only are we wasting it so people aren't eating it, it most often ends up in the landfill. And when it ends up in landfill, it creates methane gas, which is a direct contributor to the climate crisis. And in Canada, we are feeling the climate crisis worse than any other region in the world. Again, we're warming up faster. So there is this systems issue that really needs to be addressed.
Looking ahead, the future of our food system needs to prioritize sustainability. Ideally, what will the future of Canada's food system look like to ensure sustainability?
It will be a collaborative food system. All the players together. A good food system for Canada is healthy soil, deeply reduced food loss and waste. So there's always going to be a little bit just because that's the nature of the game. But if we can manage even those two things, we're in 10 million steps ahead. Manage our food loss and waste while we're working on poverty reduction strategies so people can access the food that they need using money they have. But manage the food loss and waste. We're correcting the food system, but we're also mitigating the climate challenge that we're having. And we're having a bad climate challenge. Like when we talk about BC, the fires that were in Lytton, BC, and what's interesting about that is, there was the fires, and then the rain came, and then the flood, and then the mudslides, and then, they took out the trains, they took out the trailers, so that supply chain was destroyed for how many months? Where people are thinking it's not a systems issue. It was just like maybe the fire took out some crops. It's way bigger than that, right? So we have to, again, I keep using the word system. You have to look at the whole system, and that was a climate disaster.
Food security affects all of us, and everyone has a role to play to ensure Canada's food system grows stronger and remains sustainable. Let's work together to build a more resilient and even stronger food system for our families, our communities, and for future generations.